And Josefina Vidal is joining us now from Havana. She's the head of North American Affairs for the Cuban Foreign Ministry. Ms. Vidal, thanks very much for joining us. An important subject, U.S.-Cuban relations, obviously significant right now. Let's get to the case of Alan Gross, the American who's held prisoner in Cuba. His attorney here in Washington told me, and I'll read it to you, they gave me a statement saying this: the Cuban government continues to say it is seeking a humanitarian solution on a reciprocal basis, but it consistently fails to explain exactly what that solution is or what it is prepared to put on the table. Are you prepared to tell us what you want in exchange for the release of Alan Gross?
Wolf, thank you for having me in your program. We have conveyed to the U.S. government our willingness to have a dialogue to try to solve all our problems and to normalize relations between our two countries. In this specific case, we have made clear to the U.S. government, as you said, that we are ready to have a negotiation in order to try to find a solution, a humanitarian solution to Mr. Gross' case on reciprocal basis. We are not advancing any specific formula. It has to be discussed with the U.S. government because the U.S. government has a direct responsibility on the situation, for the situation of Mr. Alan Gross. But again, we have been waiting for a response on the side of the U.S. government on this specific matter.
So there are no active discussions or negotiations underway right now between the Cuban government and the U.S. government to try to free Alan Gross?
We have conveyed to the U.S. side that we are ready to sit down to talk and to have a negotiation on this matter. And as I mentioned already to you, we have been waiting for a response. We are ready to do that.
Is there, from your perspective, is there a linkage between the release of Alan Gross and the release of what's called the Cuban Five?
Again, we are not advancing a specific solution, a specific formula. It has to be discussed among us, but definitely Cuba has legitimate concerns, humanitarian concerns, related to the situation of the Cuban Five.
But right now, is there anything you can tell us what would be good for Cuba that potentially could open the door to freeing Mr. Gross?
For Cuba, it would be right to have a response on the part of the U.S. government about its willingness to respond to our proposal to sit down and initiate a negotiation on this matter and many other matters concerning our bilateral relations. This has been our position for many years now. Because
we interviewed the Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, and we asked her about Alan Gross, and she specifically said Mr. Gross was not a spy. Mr. Gross is not an intelligence agent. Mr. Gross worked for a development group that was helping Cuba's principally in their small Jewish community. She said he is being held without justification, and he has been already held far too long. What do you say in response to what the Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, told CNN?
You know, Mr. Gross was not working in Cuba as a volunteer aid worker. He was detained in Cuba because of conducting a well-financed program by the U.S. government aimed at provoking changes in Cuba, attempting against Cuba's constitutional order. So Mr. Gross, when he was detained, was a professional under a contract by the U.S. government, fulfilling this, trying to implement this program financed by some U.S. agencies.
What evidence do you have that he was doing that?
He was convicted for violating Cuban laws. Attempting against Cuba's constitutional order is not just a crime in Cuba, it is also a crime in the United States and in many other countries. And this is the reason why he was convicted, because of attempting against our independence, our constitutional order.
Yeah, I know.
After a due process, yes.
I understand what you're saying, but specifically, what did he do with the equipment, for example, that he brought in that was a violation of Cuban law?
As part of the program he was implementing in Cuba, he was trying to set up a very sophisticated network of communications outside of the systems that exist in Cuba and without the proper authorizations, the right authorizations from the Cuban government and the Cuban agencies that regulate this mechanism and this process in Cuba as it is in other countries. But he's not in jail because of trying to help the Jewish Cuban community that, by the way, I have to say that enjoys wonderful relationships with their counterparts in the United States and many other countries. And he's not in jail because, as it is said sometimes, he was trying to give access to the Jewish community to the internet. All Cuban synagogues had access to the internet long before Mr. Gross came to Cuba.
Mr. Gross told me that when he brought all the equipment in, the people at the airport, the authorities saw the equipment, and they said you have to pay duty on it, 100%. He didn't want to pay 100%, so they just said pay $100 and you could bring the equipment in, but they inspected all of those cell phones and all of the satellite phones, whatever he was bringing in, and allowed him to bring it into the country. As a result, he says he doesn't understand why he was arrested.
As it has been written in some media reports, Mr. Gross misled U.S. Cuban authorities about the kind of equipment he was introducing into the country without the proper authorities, and he also misled members of the Cuban Jewish community about the purposes of his trips to Cuba and what he was doing in Cuba.
Let's get to the humanitarian part of this story. As you know, Rene Gonzalez, one of the Cuban Five, was allowed to, he's out of jail, he was allowed to go back to Cuba to visit his ailing mother. Alan Gross says his 90-year-old mother is dying from cancer in Texas right now. She can't travel, she can't get on an airplane. He would like to spend 2 weeks, and he promises he would come back to Cuba if you let him say goodbye, in effect, to his mother. What's wrong with that?
The cases of Mr. Gross and Mr. Rene Gonzalez, I have to tell you that are different. I can mention three differences for you. First, Rene Gonzalez, who is one of the Cuban Five, he served completely his term and to the last day. He is under a supervised release now, and there is nothing in the conditions of his supervised release that impedes him for what he did, to ask for permission to travel to Cuba to visit his ailing brother. Second, Rene Gonzalez was not detained and was not imprisoned for attempting against U.S. national security. As I mentioned, he was part of the Cuban Five, who were in the United States monitoring the activities of extremist groups, mainly in Miami, in order to prevent terrorist attacks from the U.S. territory against Cuba and to save Cuban and American lives. And third, there is nothing in his conditions now that prevents him to ask for permission to travel to Cuba. In the case of Mr. Alan Gross, he started to serve his prison terms 3 years ago, and the conditions under he is now do not allow him to go outside of Cuba.
Even for humanitarian reasons, to visit his 90-year-old mother who has cancer and is dying, are you open at all to letting him say goodbye to her?
In the case of Mr. Gross, we have guaranteed for him a good treatment. As he himself told you, he's in good shape. He receives specialized medical treatment, balanced meals. He receives visits, regular consular access and visits by friends, by religious and political leaders from the U.S. and other countries. And we have facilitated for their families and friends all the visits they have requested so far.
So just to get back to letting him visit his mother before she dies, are you saying that is unacceptable? You're not going to allow him to make that trip to Texas?
I have to tell you that the situation and the conditions of detention of Mr. Alan Gross are very much different from the conditions that the Cuban Five have endured for their long imprisonment of almost 14 years. The mother of Gerardo Hernandez, for example, died while he was in prison. The wives of two of them, Rene Gonzalez, by the way, and also Gerardo Hernandez, are not allowed to travel to the United States to visit them. They have been placed on solitary confinement several times over the years without any reasons. There have been obstacles, several obstacles for them to communicate not only with their families in Cuba, but also with their attorneys in the United States. Some of them have had problems and difficulties to get their regular legal and also personal mail in the United States. And we have also the very humanitarian case of Gerardo Hernandez and his wife Adriana, who have not been able even to conceive a child.
So because the U.S. won't allow these members of the Cuban Five to see their relatives, you're saying you're not going to let Mr. Alan Gross come back to the United States even for 2 weeks to see his mother. Am I understanding you correctly?
What we are saying is that in the case of Alan Gross and his treatment in Cuba, we have went way beyond the normal treatment that is given to persons in his same situation, and that includes the case of the Cuban Five, but we are not applying any reciprocity. We are giving Mr. Gross a dignified treatment, and he has never been in jail, by the way. He is confined at a hospital with good conditions, and he's in a good shape, as he said.
I'm sorry to press you on this, Ms. Vidal, but I'm not hearing a yes or a flat no on the answer, whether maybe this is something you would be open to. I understand you're saying the treatment he receives in Cuba is good. I understand the difference, the complaints you have about the treatment of the Cuban Five in the United States, but I'm not hearing a yes or a no on whether or not you might be open on a humanitarian basis to let him visit his mother.
As I mentioned, the cases are different, and the conditions under which Mr. Gross is now at the beginning of his sentence, it is not conceived under the Cuban system that persons in this situation can be allowed to travel abroad.
All right. Well, now you've clarified that point. While I have you, let's talk about some other U.S.-Cuban issues, if you don't mind, if you have a few moments, specifically about economic reforms in Cuba. Raul Castro, as you know, has issued some economic reforms allowing private businesses competition. Still, though, there's no free elections in Cuba. Why is that?
We have elections every 5 years in Cuba, where the Cuban general elections, because we have partial midterm elections for the municipal level and the most local level. But every 5 years, under our constitution, we have elections in Cuba for the National Assembly, and this is the National Assembly under our constitution, the organ that elects the Council of State and the President and the Vice President of the country.
But why not allow a serious opposition to to participate in those elections?
There are no restrictions in Cuba for people to run as candidates from the municipal level up to the national level in the elections. This is an open system of proposals of election that allows everybody. You do not have to be a member of the party, as it is the case in the United States, in order to run for elections in Cuba. So it is open, and there are no restrictions for people to be candidates for election in our process.
But there really is no opposition candidate who's on the ballot against President Castro, is there?
As I told you, there are no restrictions. But of course, if you are speaking about some people in Cuba that are under a payroll of the United States government in order to try to destabilize Our country, of course, this is unlawful. This is not legal in Cuba, and this is not permitted to have people subsidized and financed with hundreds of millions of dollars from abroad.
When Pope Benedict was in Havana, he was delivering a mass, and
Yes.
a man in the crowd shouted, and I'm quoting this individual, he said, "Pope, don't leave until communism falls." That's what that individual shouted out. He was then led away by plainclothesmen. Why wasn't the man allowed to speak his mind?
No, he spoke his mind. Of course, he was taken away not to make any interruptions in the mass that very respectfully was taking place in Santiago de Cuba. But as far as I know, and I think it is being published, there are no charges pressed against this person.
The Pope, while he was in Havana, called for greater freedom in Cuba. And the question is, has the government responded to what the Pope said?
You know, Cuba is very well known internationally for its contribution for the human rights and the dignity and the freedom, not only of the Cuban people, but of the people of many countries of the world. In Cuba, there are rights, and the Cuban people enjoy rights that are still a dream for millions of persons all over the world. And this contribution by Cuba and this solidarity of Cuba with other countries is very well known. And what we have done for the freedom and well-being and the human rights and human dignity of the Cuban population.
But as you know, Ms. Vidal, the freedom of the press, freedom of speech is severely restricted in Cuba. I think you'll agree with me on that, right?
We have freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of expression, and freedom in Cuba. We do not think that in this case the Cuban model is less valuable or has less recognition than what exists in many other countries of the world.
What do you think of President Obama and his efforts over these past 3.5 years to reach out to try to improve relations between the United States and Cuba?
This is our position. I mean, for many years, the Cuban government has been conveying to the U.S. side our willingness to have a comprehensive political dialogue with the United States to solve all our historical problems and to move on in order to have a productive, beneficial relationship for the benefit of our both peoples. And this is our position. We have reiterated that to the U.S. government, and we are willing to have the possibility to see that future for our two countries.
Is there any dialogue underway right now between your government and the Obama administration?
We have had talks in the last 2-3 years. As soon as the new president, President Obama, took office, some level of official dialogue that suffered a lot during the previous administration was reestablished, and we have had our biannual migration talks, and we have talked, we have conveyed in those meetings the position I just described to you about Cuba's willingness to, for the best of our two countries, to find a civilized modus vivendi with the United States.
Are you hopeful? Are you optimistic that the relationship will improve over these next few months?
We are always hopeful. We have been waiting for that moment for more than 50 years, but we are still strong believers that this future is possible for the good and the benefit of the U.S., of Cuba, of our both mutual national interests, and for our people.
Based on my conversations with very high U.S. officials, Ms. Vidal, I can tell you that if you were to make a gesture and release Alan Gross, he served already 2.5 years, that would go a long way in setting the stage for an improved U.S.-Cuban relationship. I don't know if you want to respond to that, but I'm just making that point. They have said to me on several occasions in recent days that would be a good first step. and then that dialogue could really get off the ground?
In that regard, I have to be honest with you, Wolf, and tell you that we see this statement as a new pretext by the U.S. side in order to not to move on our bilateral relationships. We have seen all over our history that any time one pretext disappears, there is another one ready at hand in order to try to justify not to normalize our relations with Cuba. I can mention many of them. For example, many years ago, the main pretext was the Cuban alliance with the Soviet Union, then the Cuban export of revolution to Latin America, then the presence of Cuban troops in Africa. Then all that disappeared at the beginning of the 90s, and a new pretext was at hand. Violations, so-called violations of human rights, so-called political prisoners in Cuba, the lack of changes in Cuba. But surprisingly enough, 2 years ago, as a sovereign decision, the Cuban government decided to release all prisoners in Cuba, including those that are considered or were considered to be political prisoners in the United States. We initiated by our own decision a process of changes in the Cuban economy, a process of changes in our structure in the government, in our institutional organization, and all that was presented for many years as a pretext and as a precondition for the United States to start a dialogue with Cuba was again ignored, was not taken into consideration, and now this is why I told you that the new pretext at hand is the case of Mr. Alan Gross. I have to tell you that to present things that way is a non-starter. It doesn't even facilitate, to present that as a pretext, as an obstacle to move on. It doesn't even facilitate the possibility of looking for a solution to the case of Mr. Alan Gross.
One final question, because we're out of time. But all of those other points that you made occurred before President Obama took office. Since taking office, he has sought to reach out, but his aides tell me that, you know what, it's not going to happen. There's not going to be a real improvement until Alan Gross is freed. It sounds like, you know, a relatively easy situation for you. Test the United States, send Alan Gross home, and see what happens. If there's no improvement, what have you lost?
As I mentioned you at the beginning of our interview, this is something that Cuba cannot do unilaterally, because there is a responsibility by the United States government for the situation of Mr. Alan Gross. So this is a topic, this is a matter, an issue that has to be discussed directly between Cuba and the United States in order to look for a solution. And
you're saying the U.S. is not ready to discuss Alan Gross's situation with Cuba? Is that what you're saying?
We have been waiting for a response and a reaction by the United States government to what we have conveyed about our willingness to sit down, to have a conversation, and to initiate a negotiation on that matter.
We will continue this conversation. Josefina Vidal, thank you so much for joining us, and we will continue to talk. We'll stay in close touch.
It is my pleasure, Wolf. Thank you.